the public is not making decisions about how to spend our money anymore.
What is that statute of limitation?
Obama's address had little impact.
The president is claiming some kind of balance.
Let the marketplace function.
Congress gave him a get-out-of-jail-free card.
Welcome to Political Junkies. In Laura Poitras's new documentary, Citizen 4, there's a puzzling scene where journalist Glenn Greenwald tells Edward Snowden that there is a new national security leaker. Now, so as not to be overheard or maybe recorded while meeting in Moscow, Greenwald ends up scribbling down some of these new revelations that are passed on by the leaker on little pieces of paper for Snowden to read. And so there we see the words Germany and the Ramstein air base be written down with a connection to drones. But it isn't mentioned or elaborated on anywhere else in the film. And now we might have some more answers. A Yemeni man, Faisal bin Ali Jabr, is suing the German government for letting the United States use Ramstein air base in southwestern Germany to carry out a drone strike in which his brother-in-law and nephew were killed in August of 2012. Now, Stefan Seibert, a spokeswoman for the German government, denies all claims that Germany lets America use air bases in the country for extrajudicial killings. And the U.S. government itself also denies Ramstein's direct involvement in the strikes. But what's really going on here? What do we know, and what have we yet to answer? Joining me now to discuss is Kat Craig, a legal director of Reprieve and one of the two human rights groups representing bin Ali Jabr. Kat, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.
So first of all, run us through the events of August 2012 and what happened to bin Ali Jabr's family.
So on the 29th of August 2012, a US drone strike hit in a village in Hadramaut, a province in Yemen, and killed 5 men, including Salim bin Ali Jabr and his son Walid, the brother-in-law and nephew of our client Faisal. Now, just days before that drone strike, Salim had used his position in the community as an imam, as a respected figure, to speak out against extremism, to preach in favor of tolerance and moderation. And that's something that he'd been doing for some time now, to the extent that his family were worried about perhaps Al-Qaeda taking issue with him. So what happened on the 29th of August was not just a terrible tragedy for him, for his family, for the community, who now live in complete fear of drone strikes. But what happened is that one of the US's key allies in the war on terror was tragically and ironically killed by the US.
And so talk to us, though, why it is that he's bringing these charges against Germany and not the United States.
Well, of course, our concern is mainly targeted at the US, but what has become clear through parliamentary questions, through investigative journalism, both in Germany and, as you say, is hinted at in Laura Poitras's film, is that without German complicity, quite simply, the drones could not fly and the strikes could not happen. What we have learnt is that all data to and from Yemen and the drones in Yemen feeds through Ramstein. We know that there are 650 analysts looking at those drone feeds and analysing the data and feeding that information back. They have 1,500 screens in front of them, over 5,000 square metres of space. Ramstein is absolutely pivotal to the drone war, and Germany, therefore, is complicit by allowing the US military to use an airbase on German soil.
Now, of course, as you mentioned, both the German government and the U.S. government are denying this completely. So where can people go if they want to see proof?
Well, the claim is available on our website and on ECCHR, our partner organisation's website shortly. That will detail, in German, alas, but nonetheless, that will detail the evidence that we have. It is ironic that this is the German government's position. They were made aware in 2010 by the US that the US intended to build greater capacity exactly for the purpose of drones. In 2011, that was re-established in building regulatory documents that were exchanged. And only in 2014, in July of this year, a parliamentary question finally elicited, after the German government being very cagey, that they had put a series of questions, a questionnaire to the Americans, asking them exactly what use was being made of Ramstein and the relationship to the drone war in Yemen. And interestingly, Germany has quite a distinct position to the US and says that because Yemen is not a country with whom Germany is at war, nor the US, of course, that these strikes are illegal. So if we can establish, as I believe we will soon be able to do very clearly that that's what Ramstein is being used for, then Germany will be in quite a difficult position. And we genuinely hope that we will be able to save the lives of innocent people like Salim, like Walid, a local police officer, like the many children who have died in Yemen, by preventing that link up in Ramstein.
And at this point, do we have any kind of precedent for this, for trying to hold another country accountable and responsible for U.S. foreign policy that they are now connected to?
Well, it's something that Reprieve does a lot of. We spend a lot of time looking at allies of the US, where countries like the UK, like Germany, are complicit in the excesses of the war on terror, the policies that go above and beyond the rule of law and the proportionate and necessary steps that we need to take in an inevitably difficult climate. And in those circumstances, we do seek to litigate against partner countries, and indeed Reprieve has done that in the UK. To date, that's been unsuccessful, but I believe that this case may well be the turning point. But in any event, what it will do is generate greater public discussion, and that's ultimately what we're looking for. We recognise that there are very useful, legitimate ways that drones can be employed. But our concern is that they operate within an atmosphere of complete secrecy. There is no accountability, there is no transparency, there is no discussion. And what we want ultimately is to get an international framework of guidelines and regulations that makes it clear when drones can and cannot be used. Because let's be clear, at the moment, drones as a form of technology are so seductive that we are on a slippery slope where we are carrying out kills and actions in countries with whom we are not at war, and in circumstances where if we had to place boots on the ground, those actions probably would not happen. And we're of the firm view, and I think Salim's case is a perfect example of that this policy at the moment is incredibly counterproductive because we are killing the very people on the ground who are most effective in combating extremism.
Right, and Reprieve certainly is one of the organizations that is doing so much work in this area. We'll be sure to keep following this case. Kat, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Now, this week, our latest military adventure to counter the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, the one that we are so reluctant to call a war, finally got a name.
Also today, the Pentagon announced the official name for the U.S. air campaign against Islamic State forces. It will be called Operation Inherent Resolve.
Inherent Resolve. I don't know if a lot of folks can define that. Maybe, that's kind of a metaphor for the operation.
That is the name. After all this time, Operation Inherent Resolve.
You heard it. Operation Inherent Resolve. Now, according to CENTCOM officials, the name, quote, is intended to reflect the unwavering resolve and deep commitment of the U.S. and partner nations in the region and around the globe to eliminate the terrorist group ISIL and the threat they pose to Iraq, the region, and the wider international community. Now, we should note that before they settled on Inherent Resolve, the Wall Street Journal reported on October 3rd that senior officers had rejected the moniker, and one unnamed official told the Journal that, quote, it is just kind of bleh. Now, I think they were right the first time. The only thing that's been inherent about our foreign policy is that we like to start wars that we can't finish, and that the architects and profiteers of those post 9/11 wars like it that way. If you go back to that question of whether or not you can actually fight a war against terrorism, whether or not you can export democracy like it's a pop-up shop, then you realize that the notion of an end date is something that is misguided, counterintuitive, and a sham. So maybe it's best that we go back to that dirty term coined during the Bush administration, global war on terror. Now, it might not sound pretty, but it makes a lot more sense than some of our other ill-suited names that have backfired. Operation Iraqi Freedom, that morphed into Operation New Dawn, and well, we all know what this new day in Iraq has now turned into. Our 13-year endeavor in Afghanistan is called Operation Enduring Freedom. Now, I wonder if that means that so-called freedom ends once U.S. and coalition troops withdraw in 2016. Our foreign policy blunders have become such a joke that the Washington Post had a competition where readers offered their own suggestions. And some of the winners there included Operation Shia Storm, Operation Sunni Delight, and Operation Fool Me Twice. Now, the truth is that a war by any other name sheds just as much blood, burns just as much money, and places just as much blame on America's shoulders when things go wrong. So it's time for a wake-up call. Joining us this week are our political junkies. We have foreign affairs reporter Mikey K, Kayvon Ashfari, a host and executive producer of The Mideast Show, and Imara Jones, the host of caffeineTV and an economic contributor at Color Lines. And joining us from our studio in Washington, D.C. is Shira Center, politics editor at Roll Call. So hello, everyone.
Hi.
Thank you all for joining me today.
Good to see you.
I'm good. I'm a little riled up about this whole inherent resolve thing. I don't know if you guys could tell, but before we move on to some of our other topics, I would love to hear from you guys what you think this new operation should be called.
Well, I'll start off. I think I don't think that's the important bit, but it's sort of been a historical thing where militaries have to give themselves a bit of a raison d'etre by naming what it is that they're doing. But the important thing, which I think we're completely missing, is what the mission is, because most people think when you have troops going into a region that the mission is all about a military response. Well, that's quite wrong, because Afghanistan is all about a State Department mission. It's about extending, or was about extending, the governance from Kabul out into the districts and the shuras within Afghanistan. The military were there to support that mission. The military were there to produce and train an Afghan national army that could institute those security structures which would allow governance and the rule of law and the judiciary and everything else to take place.
But the military was also the one that was out there carrying out what you would think of were more diplomatic functions, right? And so you had soldiers that suddenly became humanitarians because they were the ones that were getting the funding and not the State Department.
That was the function of Iraq. And what you're talking about is a comprehensive approach. So the military now has actually learned something from Iraq, which is you don't go into a region by yourself. You have a liaison officer from the State Department, you have a liaison officer from the economic side, and everything that the military does should be negotiated with those two, because there are secondary and tertiary effects to military action.
Or you just launch airstrikes and have some coalition partners that are supposedly supporting you in that, and you call it inherent resolve. I don't even know what that's supposed to mean. I mean, clearly, as I said, I think that it's all kind of useless to focus on these names. You have to look at what our foreign policy is doing, and the name is just a name. But
I think that it should be Operation Stay at Home, because we clearly don't really know what we're doing in this. And I think that the hesitancy and even the name itself is actually meant to obscure, right? Because normally when there's a clear-cut mission in terms of what we're doing, it has a very solid name, or it has a name like an Iraq War or the war in Vietnam. But this is an attempt to use words to hide what the intent is and not to clarify. And that's a part of the problem with the way that spin has actually taken over wars. And as I've spoken about before, I think that one of the things about this particular operation is that this is what ISIS wants us to do. These beheadings have come at a very particular time. They've come they haven't been consistent. They've come at a very focused time. And one of the things that they're doing in terms of trying to draw us in is that they have actually cut side deals with other people that were warring against them to no longer fight against them, like the Al-Nusra Front, an Al-Qaeda spin-off that was in war with them. And so these beheadings are, I think, a way of drawing us in. It's a way to give ISIS street cred, and that means that we're fighting this war or inherent resolve or whatever on their terms, and that's not what we're supposed to be doing.
Should we call this a war?
Yeah, I don't know if it's inherent resolve, but I would say maybe mission never ending, really. Our history of military interventionism and covert intervention in the Middle East has gone on for decades and decades, and we keep seeing the long-term unintended consequences of it. I'm sure we'll probably end up talking about that stuff today, but I think we'll likely see the blowback from these interventions, for decades to come as well.
Yeah, unfortunately, I'm afraid that seems like that's the way in which things would be heading. Now, Shira, I'll let you comment on this before we move on to our next story. Inherent resolve. What are your thoughts?
Well, I can't for the life of me think of another name for whatever it is that we're doing over there. The only thing I can think about inherent resolve is, as soon as I heard those words, I was like, you think that was focus group tested? Because it certainly sounds like it, right? It's that perfect element of vagueness and also happy nouns and adjectives. So, I think going forward, this you asked if this is a war or not. I think we're dealing in an age where wars aren't what the people who wrote our Constitution imagined they would be, right? The power we've given the United States Congress to essentially keep going out and fighting these wars, right? Even then, we had no idea what the word war would turn into 10 years later, what that means, right? Fighting against forces instead of countries at large. It's a totally different landscape, and I think the representative aspects of our government have not caught up with that.
All right, this week, the New York Times published a bombshell report by C.J. Chivers saying that during the Iraq war years of 2004 to 2011, American and Iraqi troops frequently came across chemical weapons that had been abandoned or hidden for years. Now, the report noted that in all, over 5,000 warheads, shells, or aviation bombs were discovered in that time. And according to dozens of interviews by soldiers and officials, and from documents obtained under the Freedom of Information Act, that's where the New York Times got it all. Now, at the time, the U.S. government kept all of these discoveries a secret from the public, and even denied soldiers who had been wounded the proper medical care that they needed. And these revelations left some conservatives feeling vindicated about that whole WMD thing. Counter Moonbat tweeted, "Fact, there were chemical weapons in Iraq, period, end of story." Brad Dayspring tweeted at NBC's Benji Sarlin saying, "Can we also agree that those who mocked any statement that there were WMDs in Iraq in 03 and 04 are wrong?" And Dan Gaynor tweeted, "Media said Iraq didn't have WMD. Oopsie." Now let me just say, here's a really important line from the Times report that sort of makes the entire point moot, if you ask me. CJ Chavez wrote, "The United States had gone to war declaring it must destroy an active weapons of mass destruction program. Instead, American troops gradually found and ultimately suffered from the remnants of long-abandoned programs built in close collaboration with the West." Shira, I just don't get why maybe people don't read the whole story and then they like to make claims like this. Why is this something that conservatives were pouncing on, feeling as if they were vindicated?
Are you telling me people don't read the entire story before they tweet about it sometimes? I can't believe that. No, I do think in this story, it is extremely clear, and it's a great piece, and everyone should take the time to read it, that it is clear that these weapons were designed in the West, and not only that, they are very, very old. They predate 1991, right? And finally, there was a Salon reporter that made a very, very good point, which is if these were indeed weapons of mass destruction that everyone talked about, and the Bush administration knew about it, you think they would have tried to make that public, let's say in 2007, 2008, to justify going into Iraq in the first place. Obviously, they did not. We are just hearing about it right now.
Yeah, I mean, and even, besides that, away from the whole kind of gotcha game, the fact that you had soldiers who were then, wounded by mustard gas or other chemical weapons they were finding, and they weren't given the proper medical care and they were told that it had to stay secret, I find that absolutely just mind-blowing. I can't believe that's something that we let happen. You don't seem as surprised or shocked, Mikey.
I think given everything else that's actually gone on, nothing surprises me anymore.
Well, fair enough.
But look, I think we can't. I know what's going on here. People are trying to sort of link the whole WMD thing with finding chemicals and therefore justifying the actual invasion in 2003. I was there in 2003. Across the border, I led a 4-ship of helicopters at 50 feet up into Alamara. And the night before, I was getting in and out of a nuclear, biological, and chemical suit because there were Scuds coming over the Kuwaiti border. So we were very much under the idea that Saddam did have chemical weapons. It's kind of not the point, because everyone's got chemical weapons. Russia's got chemical weapons. Syria's got chemical weapons. And you don't see America invading Russia. The point is risk. Risk is capability versus intent. He did have chemical weapons. Yes, he did. What was his intent? His intent was never to use them against the West, and it certainly didn't justify an invasion. Did Saddam have links with al-Qaeda? Well, that hasn't been proved either. So they're the two main things we need to focus on if we're trying to bring this conversation to a justification for invading illegitimately Iraq in 2003, and they still don't hold water.
No, it still certainly doesn't hold water. And to me, it's also just kind of sad, right? Because then we keep going through this endless cycle where we aren't able to actually look back on past mistakes that we have made, and to hold people accountable for them and to really be able to deal with that head on. People just live in this complete state of denial. And, maybe we shouldn't be surprised, but you would think, we went through this whole period post-Bush where that became such a bad and dirty name to be associated with. And now it's like it's all come full circle, and I feel like everyone's just completely forgotten what's happened, which you could blame President Obama's foreign policy on. I'm not going to rant about that. I want to hear from you guys.
Well, I just think it's worth mentioning that these old armaments and chemical weapons that they found they're the history of the Iran-Iraq war. That's when Saddam started this program, and that was done in coordination with the support of a lot of Western countries. And we learned for a fact from this foreign policy article about a year ago that the United States knew about Saddam's chemical weapons program, and Iran at the time was very viciously complaining at the UN, but they didn't have the evidence to verify that Saddam had those chemical weapons. But we just let that, despite having the evidence, we let him continue it and even helped him with some tactical advice and given satellite imagery of where Iranian troops were stationed. And this, again, comes back to the long-term unintended consequences. Now we're unfortunately facing a lot of that blowback, which I think is sad.
If they were effective, he would have used them. They wouldn't have been buried in the desert, which is where they had been for, 20 years, because they were left over from the war. I mean, the fact is that 20-year-old dormant weapons that are buried in the desert do not justify several 100,000 American and British and coalition troops invading a country.
That's right. And, I wish that there would be more, and there has been actually a lot of really great reporting on this over the years, too. But if you look at, the U.S. use of things like depleted uranium, and Iraq, and the effect that it's had on the populations there, and so many children that are being born with deformities and things like that. I mean, this is also something we need to come to terms with and actually have a discussion.
But we ignore the cost of war, right? Because it's ugly.
All right. How do you know if something is a bad idea? Well, one way to find out is to see if you've tried that same thing before and had negative results. Now, between 2012 and 2013, the CIA commissioned several studies looking at the agency's history of gun running. And this week, the New York Times reported on that still classified review where current and former government officials told them that the CIA's attempts to arm foreign forces had a, quote, minimal impact on the long-term outcome of a conflict. And they added that arming rebels was even less effective when militias fought without American ground support on the ground. So we've had a few ineffective arming campaigns in the past. Who cares? Well, let's not forget that our current strategy to counter the Islamic State is to arm moderate rebels in Syria. And what you might not know is that the president made that decision after he had already seen these results, too. He referred to this review in a January interview with The New Yorker when he told David Remnick, quote, very early in this process, I actually asked the CIA to analyze examples of America financing and supplying arms to an insurgency in a country that actually worked out well. And they couldn't come up with much. Well, isn't that just freaking lovely? They couldn't come up with anything, and we did it anyway. Then what's the point, Amara, of even having an internal review process?
To say that you had an internal review process, I mean, clearly you haven't spent enough time in bureaucracies. Who knows what to say? A lot of the programs and things that have been cooked up by the CIA, the majority of them have been total duds. I mean, there's some that have been effective and impactful in both ways, positive and negative, but they necessarily aren't. And that's because a lot of the tried and trusted ways of overturning regimes and that sort of thing are about building alliances, having real intelligence, having people on the ground. And those are things that historically America isn't the best at. Britain is far better at those sorts of things. And so, I don't know, covered up with an internal review process.
Hey, but you guys,
I don't know whether to say that as a compliment or not.
This is a rare moment. Here we are talking about how we never acknowledge our past mistakes. And instead, you have people that will still continue to say, torture was good, torture worked, torture helped us get terrorists, helped us get Osama bin Laden. Here we actually have a moment of acknowledging, this policy sucked, it didn't work, and we're just moving right on.
Let's just have a quick look at contemporary history. Anti-communist militias
30 seconds.
Anti-communist militias in South America, Honduras, Argentina, Nicaragua, Chile. Then go to Cambodia. None of those ended well. And that was all American support of, including the Khmer Rouge, ended up with severe genocides. Let's now go east a little bit. Let's look at the Mujahideen in the 1980s against the Soviets. There's a guy called Hekmatyar, who is now the head of Hezb Islami, which is hitting coalition convoys in Afghanistan today, which the CIA backed when he was part of the Mujahideen against the Soviets. Let's look at back in the Libyan rebels, when we went through that palaver a couple of years ago. That's a governless state now. There isn't one shred of evidence that I can see where this has ended well. And I also happen to know that through sources, the training of Free Syrian Army rebels has been going on for months in Turkey and Jordan, well before these results came out. And that is a sad fact of life. Arming rebels, when you do not know the loyalty of the rebels, you have no fusion between the rebels and what the future political alternative would be, i.e. in Syria, it's just got a bad idea written all over it. And to the great point you made, this won't come out in weeks and months. This will come back and bite us in 5 to 10 years. And that's something that we're not doing the analysis on.
And one of the few successful examples that they came up with in this still classified report was the Afghan Mujahideen. They said that, and it was somewhat instrumental in getting the Soviets to leave, but again, we all know, a lot of those Mujahideen fighters formed the core of Al-Qaeda as well.
Yeah, I was just going to bring that up. It's funny that was a success, but only if you think of it in short term.
I think we should also consider, this is a classified report, I think we should want to also think about the nature and the motivation of the leak as well. I'm somewhat speculating here, but I wonder if, there were these books written by Obama's former cabinet members, Panetta and Secretary of State Clinton, criticizing him for not arming the rebels quickly enough in Syria. So I'm wondering, and again, this is somewhat speculation, but I'm wondering, is this a controlled leak in order to kind of head off some of that criticism from the right?
Shara, what do you think about that? I mean, this administration is one that does not really play nicely with the press, and they certainly go very aggressively after whistleblowers, after leakers. But every now and then, when they need a boost, they certainly, they like to release information. Do you think if this one was deliberate?
I can't really say whether or not it was deliberate or what the motivations behind the person who gave this to the Times was, but I do think the president's decision to do this, to go and arm the rebels in Syria, was just as much about domestic politics as it was about foreign policy, right? I mean, if you look at what the last year has brought, if you're the president and you're hearing calls from Capitol Hill over and over again for action, you have Democrats absolutely quivering in a lot of re-election battles across the countries. You know you're very unpopular. You know you need to take action on Syria. You've seen the report. It says it's a bad idea, but you have to take action, and this is really the only way he can do that. So, I'm not here to defend the president by any means or his decision to do so, but I see why domestically why he did what he did, given the politics of the situation.
Yeah, but then it's like you open the door to starting to arm rebels, and then you have the John McCains and the Lindsey Grahams saying we need to take one more step, and there's the dreaded mission creep that I think it opens it up to. All right, now this week, the long-awaited documentary Citizen 4 premiered. Or I guess last weekend. Directed by Laura Poitras, the film takes a deep look at the post-9/11 surveillance state that's emerged, and it gives us an inside look at whistleblower Edward Snowden. That includes the tense moments of those 8 days when Poitras and Greenwald spent time with Snowden in a hotel room in Hong Kong as the documents were first released and Snowden's identity was revealed to the world. But it also gave us a few details on Snowden's afterlife and his personal life, including breaking the news that his girlfriend Lindsay Mills has moved to Russia to live with him. So, while he is still an international outlaw, Snowden can at least visit with his family, move freely about Russia, and live with his partner. Glenn Greenwald said of reality versus perception on Snowden's life, quote, vital to the U.S. government and its assorted loyalists in the commentariat is to depict whistleblowers as destined to live miserable lives. But the fact that he is now living in domestic bliss as well with his long-term girlfriend whom he loves should forever put to rest the absurd campaign to depict his life as grim and dank. Certainly other whistleblowers before Snowden did not have the same luck, I guess you could say, if you want to call it luck. I mean, you look at Chelsea Manning, but has Snowden somehow broken that chain?
I think so. I mean, the state of whistleblowers under the Obama administration is terrible, actually. The Obama administration has used the U.S. Espionage Act to prosecute whistleblowers more than any previous administration combined. So it's actually, I thought it was kind of nice to see him living a somewhat, I don't want to say ordinary life, but having some fun to himself too. I mean, it would be naive to assume that he's not under the careful watch of the FSB at the whole time too, so his life is not ordinary. I'm sure it's tough at the same time. But I think yeah, I mean, if he was here, he would, and this brings up another point that I want to talk about too. I mean, this is a far cry from the days of Daniel Ellsberg and the Pentagon Papers, who did not face a pretrial detention and who was able to speak to the media freely. If Snowden was here, I mean, we can pretty clearly assume that he would face a gag order and would actually be under pretrial detention, just like Chelsea Manning faced.
Yeah, exactly why he wanted to leave the country, right? And it was because he knew that he couldn't be here, and he wanted to be able to have some kind of control over his image, his message, because someone like Chelsea Manning, we never even ended up hearing from him.
But he's a special person, though, because if you listen to what he says, he looked at all of the other cases of all of the other whistleblowers, including some of his colleagues at the NSA who blew the leak and who leaked and were penalized just a few years before he did. And he planned out and mapped out exactly all of the things that you had to do in order to avoid the dragnet, in order to be able to try to move about the world, and in order to try to be able to have a life. He also didn't have children. He wasn't married at the time. And so there are a lot of things about him where he was able to craft a way forward, and that's really unique. And most of the people who work deep inside the bureaucracy don't have those options.
No, I mean, listen, it certainly wasn't easy either way, right? Like we said, he's essentially an international fugitive. He had to spend
for the rest of his life.
What was it, 40 or 50 days in the transit zone, sleeping at the airport. There was a presidential plane that was grounded. His passport was taken away. It's not like he's just like, hey, I'm in Russia now. Peace and love to everyone. But I think that this film also, and I don't know if any of you here have had the pleasure of seeing it yet, but it was humanizing. It gave us more of an inside look at Snowden. We got to see kind of him become a little bit more nervous and a little bit more unraveled as those 8 days went on, where he first was very cool, calm, and collected and composed. And I think that that is important for him because public opinion is still incredibly mixed. People think that they want to know or believe that they want to know what the government is doing when it comes to surveillance, but they're not so sure about Snowden. Do you think that this could help his image?
Well, I think you hit the nub of the question. And all these months now downrange, I think it would be useful for us to sit back and sort of say, was what he did morally right? And it's the debate between national security and those freedoms that we all like to think that we have. And so what I think is that we should have a look now and just say, well, are we grateful for Snowden exposing the dirty dealings of what government are doing? Are we happy with that? Does it allow us to leverage more transparency for the government? Or are people still sort of mortified that, he's actually potentially blown national security, and does it pave the way for more sort of serious, more sinister whistleblowers to actually come out and actually compromise?
Yeah. Well, I don't know about you guys. I mean, I'm grateful and I'm happy that he did it. And I think that this is this is something that we need to know. And these are debates that we need to be having publicly. And while they are pretty pathetic, at least we have some moves towards reform that are underway. And the fact that there is another national security leaker, maybe not even just one, right, but another one that has been confirmed. And if you watch the film, when Glenn Greenwald is telling Snowden about what this person has, talking about the terrorist watch list, talking about Germany and drone strikes, his face starts to light up. He's even shocked and surprised that someone would go this far.
But was your opinion when it happened? Is your opinion now the same as
my
now?
opinion has stayed steady because I'm someone who believes in transparency and I want to break through government secrecy.
Even if it means breaking the law.
Yes,
I don't think. Go ahead. If he's doing it because the government is breaking the law, the government is unconstitutionally placing millions of Americans under surveillance, then absolutely, I think someone needs to call the government out because otherwise, what's to stop them?
Because when he took his oath in office, both as a soldier and in the NSA, his oath is to the people of the United States and to the Constitution. It is not to the president. It is not to the national security establishment.
As is any government officials, right? Their oath is to the Constitution.
I don't disagree with any of that.
And to the people of the United States.
I agree, but it's not as black and white as that. And I'm not defending him, but in order to keep the country safe, in order to trawl for those organic indigenous ideologies, the radicals that are growing with American passports.
They need to spy on everyone?
No, I'm not. And this is it. Do we
set up some rules?
We need to spy on
Do we know the process?
We do know the process.
Of which we are trying to locate and track those people that are going to put us in harm's way.
Collect everyone's emails, collect everyone's phone calls, collect everyone's texts, spy on angry birds to trap people who are.
Well, that's what we're learning. Unfortunately, guys, we don't have
the capability to track 330 million.
There is.
Emails.
The NSA has.
Why would you want to do that?
But the problem is that now it's this whole needle in the haystack approach. Is when you collect everything, then you can't find probably the one thing you're looking for. Shira, I'm just going to let you quickly weigh in on this too. Sorry, you're at the disadvantage of not being here in the studio with us. But, not what's your take on NSA surveillance. That's another conversation for another day, one that I'm always happy to have.
We shouldn't go into
but Snowden, do you think that he is now coming out on top and maybe encouraging others, partially based on the fact that it seems like he's won in a way?
Yeah, I haven't seen specific polling that's shown public perception of him increase or decrease. But if I had to guess, I would say his standing is probably elevated slightly from the first time people ever heard his name. I do think it is interesting that his girlfriend is now over there with him. According to some of the articles about the film, she didn't really know all of this was going on. So to be a fly on the wall when they had to have that discussion, reunited in Russia, I don't know. But look, I think the other thing about him is as you've mentioned, he is the exception for whistleblowers. He is not the rule, right? Most whistleblowers end up in jail for decades, or they end up, in some cases, an alcoholic, or terrible things happen when people are whistleblowers. So I think if prospective whistleblowers, if you would even call them that, in the kinks of government bureaucracy right now, I doubt they're looking at Edward Snowden and seeing a path to success for themselves.
All right, fair enough. All right, guys, now it is time for one of our favorite parts of the show.
Who has the upper hand?
Oh, Mitt Romney. He's a businessman, former presidential candidate, and apparently he's also now a comedian. While campaigning for Joni Ernst in Iowa, Romney made the following joke about President Obama.
He said President Obama went to the bank to cash a check, and he didn't have his ID. And the teller said, you got to prove who you are. And he said, how should I do that? She said, well, the other day, Phil Mickelson came in. He didn't have his ID, but he set up a little cup on the ground, took a golf ball, putted it right into that cup so we knew it was Phil Mickelson. We cashed his check. And then Andre Agassi came in, and Andre Agassi didn't have his ID either. He put a little target on the wall, took a tennis ball and a racket, hit it onto that target, time it again. We knew that was Andre Agassi, so we cashed his check. And she said to him, is there anything you could do to prove who you are? And he said, I don't have a clue.
But I'm
Romney's got jokes. So, who has the upper hand here? Is it, Shira, I'm going to let you start first. Is it Mitt Romney because he actually proved he is not a robot, has a sense of humor, won over the crowd, or President Obama because he still won the election?
Oh gosh, is it a draw? Would you really want to be president right now? I mean, right? Like that's not a really fun gig. So I do think this is always interesting, right? Like I love candidates when they are post-candidacy and can become somewhat a little looser in what they say and this kind of things. You really finally get the glimpse of what they really like as people. And that's why I cannot wait for the day too when Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton are not running for anything and you kind of see this side of their personality as well. So, he made a funny, great. I'm sure he's been making those kinds of, pretty semi-funny jokes all the time with the staff, and they've been telling him for years, please never do that on a podium, Governor. Please never, ever do that. So, good for him. He made some people laugh.
Kayvon, who has the upper hand?
I mean, well, I was just kind of impressed by him because his setup was actually pretty flawless, and his punchline, not bad either. So, I mean, if he wants to give up the business and the running for politics thing and take a career as a stand-up comedian that specializes in bad dad jokes, go for it. But in the end, yeah, I mean, the president is the president. He's going to have a huge legacy. Romney's going to be a footnote compared to him.
Ouch, a footnote. Imara?
I think President Obama has the upper hand because Romney is making these ripples in the water that he may be interested in running again. So hopefully he won't be leading with these jokes. But I don't know. I mean, and so if you are trying to still get the job that you lost, you clearly view yourself as a loser. So I think President Obama probably has the upper hand.
I think it was a good delivery, but I actually think he was using a teleprompter.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah?
I don't think
he didn't memorize that
I don't
one?
think that was from the heart.
It was flawless.
At least,
why did he keep saying
he
Andre
had good timing,
Agassi?
though, right? I mean, the timing is not nothing.
He's definitely been to the UCB improvisation course
Since
then.
All right, guys, on Wednesday night of this week, the Florida gubernatorial race emerged with a new star. I know it wasn't current Governor Rick Scott or his opponent, former Governor Charlie Crist. It was an electric fan.
Governor Rick Scott, we have been told that Governor Scott will not be participating in this debate. Governor Crist has asked to have a fan, a small fan, placed underneath his podium. The rules of the debate that I was shown by the Scott campaign say that there should be no fan. Somehow there is a fan there, and for that reason, ladies and gentlemen, I am being told that Governor Scott will not join us for this debate.
It's bad when even the moderator is laughing at you. Now, after 7 minutes of stalling, Scott did return to the stage to face his opponent and an audience of confounded Floridians. So, looks like the fan might even be giving Clint Eastwood's chair a run for its money. So, who's got the upper hand here? Is it Crist for showing up on time? Rick for getting a few extra minutes to think things over? Or maybe the fan, who had more airtime than Scott and Crist combined and has now become the best new accessory on the campaign trail? Mikey, what do you say?
Well, when I first read the story, and it's probably because I'm a bit thick, but I had this notion of a Mets baseball supporter twiddling one of those things when it comes to a fan, and I was thinking, why would you want to bring a person up, like the number one fan? I didn't realize it was a fan that blows air. I just think this is a really sad indictment of American politics, and these guys should be discussing the things that are important to the people, not whether someone's using a fan or not. And I think it's embarrassing for both of them. I really do think it's an embarrassing situation.
Painfully
embarrassing.
Especially for Rick Scott. I mean, whatever. If it gets, a debate though, if you're out there and you are trying to highlight your your stance on certain issues. You want to look your best. If you get hot, have a fan. That's fine, whatever. I'd have like some powder and some water. Be comfortable if you're a political candidate. But for Rick Scott to make a big deal out of it is just really pathetic.
Well, I mean, if you're wondering why Florida is a hot mess, it's because a fan won the gubernatorial debate. I mean, I think that it is not only an indictment, but it also is an indictment of the politics of that particular state, which has a long history of very sad moments in American politics, and that this is just yet another one. So I don't necessarily know if it's an indictment of our entire system, but of the Sunshine State, it certainly is. Yeah.
Does the fan have like a Twitter account yet?
I'm sure it does.
Just wondering.
And I'm sure it
Clint
talks,
Eastwood's
too.
chair got one immediately.
Totally Charlie Crist on top, I think, here. I mean, Rick Scott unfortunately had to look pretty ridiculous for about 6 minutes, and I'm curious. I want to know who were the handlers there that allowed that to happen for so long.
Yeah.
Were you not doing your jobs there? What happened?
It was the governor himself, though. He apparently, at the last minute, got the note about the fan and decided that he wasn't going to come out.
Oh, the fan. All right, Shira, I'm going to give you the final word here.
Yeah, Charlie Crist won this one. I think he has the upper hand, you would say. If he wins, if he becomes the next governor of Florida, people are going to look back to this as being a seminal moment, the campaign that really changed everything. And that is totally ridiculous because it revolves around a debate about whether or not a fan is considered an electronic in like a debate contract, right? It is completely ridiculous. But I mean, there is some funny kind of lore and history about this fan. Charlie Crist has always had this fan with him. His political reporters have joked about it for over a decade. It's made other kind of somewhat controversial appearances over the course of his career, right? I mean, for a fan, it's gotten a whole lot of attention. So, it's a footnote.
Yeah, a sad indictment of American politics. And on that note, I'm going to say goodbye. Thank you all for joining me on this round of Political Junkies. Mikey, Amara, Shira, and Kayvon, thank you all so much for being here. All right, guys, stick around. There is much more coming up on HuffPost Live.